All right, welcome back. Here we go. Cold War in Asia. And so in the first video, we kind of talked about the Cold War in Europe and what's going to happen. Now let's look at what goes on in Asia. And while the Allies are victorious, or capitalism, I suppose, is victorious in at least in Eastern Europe, that's not necessarily going to be the case in Asia. And so we're going to start off with China. During World War II, China was a major battleground in the war. It's not one that we talk about a ton in the United States, but America sent a ton of money, a lot of money, to two different leaders in China during the time. The first one is going to be Chiang Kai-shek, who is going to be a leader of the Chinese nationalists. And he is the preferred leader of China in the eyes of the United States. We sent him $3 billion in money. However, Chiang Kai-shek is relatively inefficient with his leadership, and his government's not very good, and ultimately doesn't have the support of the Chinese people. And the other leader that we're going to send money to is going to be a guy by the name of Mao Zedong. And Mao Zedong is the face of the Communist Party in China, and he has the support of the peasants. He's promised to bring a better life to them. He's improved food production. He's encouraged literacy, and by 1945, he's kind of defeated the Japanese in much of northern China. So following the war, Mao Zedong and Kai-shek are going to fight a somewhat long civil war, not a real long civil war. They're going to fight a civil war in China, in which the nationalists led by Kai-shek are going to fight these new communists for political control. And Truman ultimately refuses to send military troops in to support Kai-shek, but he does send them a ton of money. But that nationalist army is very weak, and it's corrupt, and it's not very efficient. And if you don't have the support of the people, it's very difficult to fight a civil war. And so ultimately, the communists are going to maintain control of China. And in 1949, the nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek are going to flee to the island of Taiwan. And so Mao Zedong is going to establish the People's Republic of China. And China is ultimately lost into communism. Now, you have the questions of, did containment fail? Well, on the outside, you look at it and yeah, communism spread, so containment probably failed. However, people looking at it from the United States point of view, or at least from the State's Department point of view, are going to say that it was internal forces that led China to becoming communist. It wasn't necessarily the external forces of the Soviet Union. And so, ultimately, you can't force people into ideas that they don't want to support themselves. And so China falling to communism isn't a failure of containment, but an internal factor of the Chinese wanting to live under a communist threat. Okay, so then we get into Korea, and that's going to be a different story, because following World War II, the Korean Peninsula had been divided along the 38th parallel, which is just down the middle of the Korean Peninsula. And the North had been was a communist country, and the South was democratic. And at the beginning of the war, or at the end of the war, at the end of World War II, the United States has a pretty substantial military presence in Korea. But by June of 1949, that levels have dropped to almost nothing. And so the Soviets are watching the American reaction to the spread of communism in China, and they see the Americans. They spend some money, but they don't really, they don't put their money, they don't put their boots, so forth, on the ground to do that. And so the Soviet Union starts to supply the North Koreans with guns and money and tanks and airplanes, and encourages them to launch a surprise attack and try to gain access to the entire Korean peninsula. And so on June 25th, 1950, North Korea launches a surprise attack against South Korea, and they overrun the South, and they push back the South Koreans and the American forces that are left in South Korea, almost off of the peninsula to a little town called Busan. Um, and so the Americans are going to react to that very, very quickly. President Truman orders the United States troops stationed in Japan to support South Korea. We take our warships that were in the Pacific and we station them between Taiwan and China. And you know, the question there's how is this an example of containment? Well, it's trying to stop the spread of communism from outside of a nation to that nation. And so we're not going to let the communists come into Taiwan, which is a democratically elected government, and overrun that, or we're not going to allow the North Koreans just to take democratic South Korea without a fight. And South Korea asked the United Nations for help. 16 nations send about 500,000 troops. The vast majority of them are going to be Americans. And they're going to be led by Douglas MacArthur. If you remember Douglas MacArthur, he was the guy from the Philippines that left the Philippines and then promised to come back. And he's kind of this folk hero in American history circles. He always, you know, always smokes like a corncob pipe, and it's always very egotistical of himself. And so, anyways, MacArthur runs a multiple front counterattack using amphibious troops and push American troops from Japan, and they push the North Korean army all the way back to the Chinese border by October of 1950. And well, is this an example of containment? No, it's not, because if you look, all right, the nation's cut in two, and you know, ultimately what the Americans maybe should have done to maintain containment was to push the communists back to the original line of division, but they push them all the way back to China. When they do that, the Chinese government is very anxious, I suppose, and sends their Chinese army into Korea. So 300,000 Chinese troops come in to defend North Korea, and it swings the balance of the war to a point where the Americans and the United Nations troops fall back south of Seoul, Korea, and they kind of dig in and they settle through a winter of 1951. To break this stalemate, General MacArthur asked Harry Truman if he could use if he could use nuclear weapons on China to you know, swing the case of the war. And Truman says no, he doesn't want to attack the Chinese. You know, it's a huge country because, well, it's a huge country. It's the most populated nation in the world at the time. China and the Soviet Union are allies, and if you attack China, you're probably going to be fighting the Soviets as well. And he fears that this would lead to the Third World War. Another World War II hero there, Omar Bradley, says the war with China was the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong enemy. And so without fighting the Chinese or using nuclear weapons, the United States retakes Seoul, which is the capital of Korea. They reestablish the border of the 38th parallel, and the war ends. The Russians suggest a ceasefire on June 23rd, and that brings an end to the war when an armistice is signed. However, it doesn't necessarily take care of our issue between MacArthur and Truman. And I know this is a world history class, but you have a general fighting a president, and MacArthur goes behind Truman's back and basically argues in Congress for the use of nuclear weapons and attack against China. And it kind of plays to the American public. And so Truman turns around. Truman's job as president of the United States is commander-in-chief of the military, and he fires MacArthur. And so you have this fallout between the military and the presidency during Truman's administration. Okay. Have a little bit about duck and cover right there if you want to if you want to read a little bit about that. And we'll come back and we'll look at the 60s here in just a minute. So enjoy that, and we'll see you then.